Kathy, can you hear me okay? Can everybody hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up or something if you can hear me, and I'll get started. Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy Seiler, and I am um, recording here in my office in Missoula, Montana. And it's a snowy day here outside and really cold, but it's starting to warm up, so I'm pretty happy about that. We had our earliest snowfall this year ever, and the coldest temperature ever, 29 below in Potomac, which is nearby, and then we had 13 and a half inches of snow. So wasn't quite ready for winter. Um, but anyway, today I'm going to be talking to you about core watercolor grounds. So, or sorry, core grounds. So watercolor ground and cold press ground and light dimensional ground, and how these grounds can be used on different surfaces such as canvas and plexiglass and birch panels, like cradled birch panels. And usually watercolor artists think all they can paint on is paper, and you can certainly still paint on paper, but these watercolor grounds, core watercolor grounds, can enable you to paint on canvas, putting the ground on the canvas or on the birch panel or any other substrate pretty much that you could think of, and then paint watercolor on it. And then all you have to do is varnish it, and you can hang it on the wall. So you could put the grounds on the canvas, on the sides of the canvas, paint on the canvas, on the watercolor ground, and then varnish it and hang it on the wall at an art show. So you could save a lot of money on framing and get some really interesting and um, textures and other kind of depth in your painting. So we're going to be talking about that today, and I'm going to be using uh, earth colors from QoR. This is a little set of earth colors I got just for this demo. Whoops, there we go. And they are just beautiful colors, just something different, like a limited palette to try for this demo. So I'm going to switch over to my other camera. I just want to welcome you all here. Again, I'm Nancy Seiler. I'm a golden working artist, and this is on the QoR watercolor page. I do watercolors and acrylics and a little bit of oil and cold wax. So I'm going to show you some of my journals, nature journaling, because I really like nature journaling a lot. And I'm actually using some of these grounds in my nature journal and just letting them dry and then coming back to them and painting. So I'll show you a couple examples of that. And then I'll show you how to use the grounds, how to tint the grounds so you can work on a colored surface. And we'll go from there. So if you have any questions, you can type them in the comments section of the Facebook page, and Kathy Jennings with QoR Watercolors at Golden is going to help answer my questions. So thank you all for coming, and let's have some fun. So I'm going to switch over to my other camera now. So if you have any questions, you might want to jot these down. This is the site for QoR Watercolors, QoRcolors.com. If you want to email Golden with a question, if you think of something after the live here, you can just email them help@goldenpaints.com with any questions that come up. Here's my website. I'm going to be doing some online classes with nature journaling and watercolor coming up here pretty soon. I do have another Facebook Live, if you want to jot this down, on November 11th, where I'll be talking about the QoR Mini. And I'll be unboxing the QoR Mini. So come back for that. I'll also be talking on November 11th a little bit about working with the QoR Mini on watercolor paper and in my journal. So let's get started. Okay, so I'm using today, I'm going to do a little bit of a demo with watercolors. A lot of them I have finished already, just to show you in the interest of time. But this is a Princeton Velvet Touch 3/4 inch flat brush and a Princeton Velvet Touch number 8 round. And these work great for journaling and for nice filling up your brush with a lot of water and just working wet into wet. So I just want to show you a few things here. These are the, sorry, let me move this. These are the 6 colors that are in the Earth Colors set, and I'll just go over these briefly. This is Sap Green, and this is a transparent color, and it's a staining color. That's what this solid red dot means, or solid black dot means. This is staining. This will stain your paper a little bit more than, say, Naples Yellow, which is not staining here. And then we have transparent brown oxide, which is a transparent color. Indigo, which is semi-transparent. Naples Yellow, which is semi-opaque. Raw Umber, which is semi-opaque. And Venetian Red, which is just a really beautiful, rich color, which is opaque. So I'll move these over. These I used on, this is watercolor paper, and I just want to show you to compare what this looks like on other grounds, but this is watercolor paper. This is a 140-pound cold press, and you can see I worked wet into wet. So that's just showing you on paper. Now, here's some examples of absorbent ground. I'm sorry, watercolor ground right here, which is a very absorbent ground. So Watercolor Ground by QoR. And what I've done is I've taped off in my journal, and I've just put Watercolor Ground, just brushed it on in my journal, and you can get some really cool effects. And again, this is just on paper. And then the next one is cold press ground right here. This is like handmade paper in a jar, and this is what it looks like spread into the journal. So gives you an idea of the texture you can get just on paper. And then light dimensional ground has more of a dimensional surface here. It's very light in weight, and that's why it's called light dimensional ground, very light in weight. So you could actually spread this on a very large cradle board, like 40 by 40 inches, and it'd be very light in weight compared to putting a heavier ground on a cradle board where you could barely lift it. So this is, I have to get this a little closer to see the depth. But again, you can do watercolor right on paper by putting the grounds on there. Let's see if I have any questions so far here. Okay. Yeah, grounds in my art journal. Great. So Kathy or Kevin can answer where you can purchase these. I tend to go to blick.com and get my materials, and usually they're a little cheaper than going directly to Golden. You can also go to any art store and pick these up. So just take a look around and see what you have available, but they're available online. The next one we're going to talk about is, I'm going to talk a little bit more about light dimensional ground. So again, light dimensional ground it's kind of like icing, sort of like frosting, but very, very light. And then you put it on with a palette knife. And I'm going to show you how to do that after I show you these examples. So these were done on a Cradle birch panel. That's what this is. And I spread the ground on to the top with a palette knife. And you can see the depth, the thickness of this. And these have been varnished. So you can really see the texture that you get with these grounds. And then I'll talk about varnishing at the end here a little bit more. So that's on a Cradle birch panel. This is on paper, but it's been tinted. The ground has been tinted here. You can see I've tinted it with quinacridone fluid, or fluid quinacridone burnt orange by Golden. This is a fluid acrylic, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I wanted to show you how flexible this was, these grounds. Very flexible, they're not going to crack. So you can really get a lot of depth of these. You could paint on wood, on a wood dowel. I mean, it's just sky's the limit with that. So that's light dimensional ground. This is cold press ground. And this is just, these have been varnished again. This has been varnished, but this is again on a cradled birch panel. And you can see the texture, hopefully this focuses. A little bit of a sheen because I added a little bit more gloss on this for fun. Gloss varnish, I want to say. You need to, when you varnish these, you need to use spray varnish and not a brush. If you use a brush, you will smear your watercolor. So always spray. And again, this is cold press ground, very flexible. And this has been tinted here too with fluid green gold. And then I've got absorbent ground. This is on paper, tinted on paper here. Again, very flexible. And this is a very thin, diluted layer of watercolor ground. You can dilute this up to 25% with water, so it's very thin. And this is painted on plexiglass. And what I did is I put a very thin layer, and you can actually see through this a little bit. So you can see it's translucent. But I was able to paint in watercolor right on this plexiglass. So that's an option. Now I'm going to show you how this absorbent ground, I'm going to paint with this. I've got my paint out on the palette here, all 6 of those paints from the earth colors. And what I've done is to make my paint resoluble is I've spritzed it with my really messy spray bottle here. And I just spritzed it to just make these resoluble so that they're a little easier to paint with. Let's see if I have any more questions before we go for. Okay, Kathy, looks like Kathy's answering some questions for me. Thanks again, Kathy. All right. So I'm going to get this really pretty wet with water. This is absorbent ground on a cradle panel. And what I've done with this is I'm going to show you how I've treated this wood panel with gloss medium first in a moment, just to make sure that the birch resin doesn't migrate up through your painting and you end up with surface induced discoloration. So you want to put 2 coats of gloss medium on here first, and then I put 2 coats of watercolor ground on here that had been slightly diluted. So you can see how absorbent that is just from how much water I'm putting on here. It's very absorbent. And I'm really putting a lot on here so you can see what this looks like with actual paint on it. And I'm just going to take a couple, I might use some Venetian red because it's so awesome. And I'm just going to paint right on here. This is again very wet, but you can see how it absorbs very quickly into the ground. This is indigo. Here's some sap green. And then I'll put in some Naples yellow. But you can really see how it's starting to move and be absorbed into the surface. And then once this dries, I can actually put another layer on. And the examples I just showed you on Cradle Board, I put a couple layers on. Put a little bit more. How about put some umber on here, raw umber. So anyway, you can really see how that absorbs. And we'll come back to that. I'll let that dry for a little bit, and then we'll come back and see how that looks. Okay, any questions so far? All right, so next thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you a few more examples. These are the Cradle boards that I've purchased in the past. This one is from Blick. It's 6 by 6. It's 1.5 inches deep. Nice cradle board. Not very expensive. This one I got in at Artisan Craftsman in San Diego. Again, this is a very nice cradle board. Not very expensive. I'd say a couple dollars, $2 to $3 each, 5 by 5. And these are the kind of boards that I do little watercolors on. This is just QoR on paper, but you can see how you could do this kind of loose watercolor on these grounds and really get a lot of depth and texture. All right. So let's look at how to prepare these surfaces so you can put grounds on them. So when you're working with acrylics or pigments, I usually put on some gloves just to keep things safe. It's not so much the acrylics, it's more the pigments. So if you're using a cadmiums or cobalts or things like that with your pigments, you don't want to be putting your hands in them. You want to use gloves. So very easily, I'm going to, I've already put one layer of gloss medium on this board. I'm going to put another layer on. And you can see it's got a little bit of a sheen, but it was just a raw wood board like this. You can see this birch. And now this is one layer of gloss medium. I'm going to put one more layer on. And I just put it right on the board. And you can see it's white, but when it dries, it will be clear. So I'm just going to spread this out, go the other direction maybe. And just put a nice smooth layer on that. Not very thick. And this dries pretty quick because this is a very thin layer. Acrylics dry depending on your environment. If you were in Palm Desert or Palm Springs, California, this would be dry in a few minutes because it's so arid down there. If you were up in Maine and it was a rainy day, it would take a little longer to dry. So this dries pretty quick. And you can, as long as it's thin, you can hit it with a hair dryer or something like that, but never put a hair dryer onto thicker acrylics or thick fluids or thick heavy body because you'll end up with crazing. the surface of the acrylic will dry quicker than what's underneath, and it will crack. So you want to always let acrylics dry naturally if you can. Since this is so thin, I could hit it with a hairdryer. I'm not going to because of the noise. So I'm just going to put that aside. And then I'm going to show you these three colors that I'm going to tint my grounds with. So the first one is a fluid teal. Golden always puts a swatch over their hash marks on here, and you can see with green gold that it's more transparent. So you can really see what this looks like before you buy it if you're at a store. So this is opaque. You can see when I painted one layer over these marks, this is graphite and a thin black pen and a thicker Sharpie. I painted right over that, and you can see how opaque that teal is. So when I go to tint my ground with this, I'm only going to use one drop. So let's do that first. So I'm going to use, on this one, I'm going to use cold pressed ground. Oh, sorry, just a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. Watercolor ground here. I'm going to use watercolor ground first. And I'm going to tint that with one drop of teal, and I'm also going to dilute it. So I'm going to show you how to do that, and then how to put it onto a birch panel. So I'm just going to put a little bit. You can see kind of how the viscosity of that. It's a little bit thick. You can put it on thickly, but you can also dilute it. So watercolor ground, it's a fluid acrylic primer, and it creates a porous surface, and it's similar to hot press paper, and it dries to an absorbent, light, fast, and flexible surface. You can also do a lot of lifting with like a brush to lift pigment off of this, and a lot of scrubbing. It will withstand that. So the directions are to apply 2 or more coats to a paper, panel, canvas, and let it dry overnight before applying watercolor washes. So the one I just showed you, I did a few days ago actually. So here's the ground. I'm going to add a little bit of water to that. No more than 25%. And then I'm just going to add 1 drop of fluid teal and mix it up. And you can see how that 1 drop, just 1 drop of fluid teal, went a really long way. So this gives you an option of painting on a tinted surface. All right. So I'm going to show you the watercolor ground right on the surface, right out of the container here. I'm going to do a little bit of white on here. You can see how thick it is without being diluted. I'm just going to, and you can mix this. You can do tinted and untinted. So I'm just going to do a little bit of white up here in the corner. And then I'm going to go ahead and pick up some of this, put it on here. And you can also do this, you know, put your brush in here and move it onto here. And you can see it's very easy. It's a little bit more diluted, so it spreads a little easier. But you want to do about 2 coats of this, letting it dry overnight between applications. Okay, so that's watercolor ground. Tinted with 1 drop of fluid teal. All right, put that aside to dry. And then the next one we're going to do is, let's see, cold press ground. Cold press ground. And I'm going to tint that with 8 drops of fluid green gold. And that's because fluid green gold is more transparent and has a lower tint strength than fluid teal. So let's do that. All right. And again, I've already prepared my panel. I have 2 coats of gloss medium on this cradle board. And I'm going to take a look at comments here while I'm getting going. So let's see. Looks like Kathy's helping me out here. Great. I'm just going to keep going. So I've got, again, cold pressed ground. And you can see that this is a lot thicker. And this is like the handmade paper in a jar. I'm going to put, I can use this really thick on here. Get really thick. So acrylic will shrink a little bit when it dries, so you can put it on very thickly. And I'm going to tint this. Put a little bit more in here. And I'm just using a cheapo plastic palette knife. You don't need anything fancy. So I'm going to spread this out on the board. And cold pressed ground, it creates a rough paper-like surface, and it accepts color washes really readily. It produces variations in stain, and these fibers that are in this cold pressed ground are synthetic, so they are not going to break down with acids or age, so lasts a long time. You can smooth this out. I'm just going to do a little bit here. You can see you can carve into it. You can make it really textured. And if you wanted to smooth it out, you would just dip your palette knife in water and spread over it, and it smooths it. You can see how smooth that gets. So either way, do it that way. Now I'm going to tint this, the rest of this, and I'm actually going to put 8 drops of green gold in it. I'm not going to dilute this ground. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that was fluid green gold. And then I'm going to mix that in with this cold pressed ground to create a tinted surface to paint on. So if you want a different color other than white to paint on, you can do this. Just put it right on your board and spread it around. Pretty fun. Go up into the white area, bring the white down into here, just play around with it. So you can see how interesting that is as a tinted surface on a cradled board. It's pretty thick. I'm going to put this aside. All right. Now we're going to go back to the one where I put the second coat of gloss medium on. And again, this prevents surface-induced discoloration. So if you're working on masonite, for instance, that's going to really pull that dye up into your painting if you don't treat it with 2 or prep it with 2 coats of gloss medium. So make sure you do that if you're working on wood for sure. So this is almost dry, but I'm going to go ahead and do this. You want to let it dry completely. And I'm going to show you this light dimensional ground. And maybe Kathy can put on the comments how much lighter this is than, for instance, like molding paste or something that would be another acrylic product. It's way lighter in weight. So I'm going to put some right on the board. And then I'm going to tint this with quinacridone burnt orange. And I'm going to use 2 drops of that. So again, this is quinacridone, fluid quinacridone burnt orange, and you can see it's got a pretty good tint strength to it, but it's still transparent. So you've got one that's opaque, one that's very transparent, and one that's it's transparent too, but it's got a higher tint strength, so you can really see that. So look how thick that is on the board. Doesn't come off. I mean, it's not going to fall off, but you can spread this out like frosting, and that's kind of what it feels like. I'm not much of a baker, but I did bake a pie for the first time in 25 years, and it actually turned out pretty good. So look at that texture on there. Okay, this is light dimensional ground. And light dimensional ground, again, it creates a very lightweight, absorbent surface. And it's similar to cold press watercolor paper. It can be applied smoothly or used to create a highly textured pattern. So you could go right over this when it's wet. You want to do this when it's wet and make it very smooth, like so. Or you can carve into it with a palette knife, or this is a color shaper. This is rubber on the end. And this is professionalartistbrushes.com color shaper, and you can carve right into that ground. All right, now I'm going to tint this with two drops of quinacridone burnt orange. 1, 2. Not very much paint. Goes a long way. All right. It's really pretty. I'm just going to leave it kind of streaked, I think, and put it right on here. Spread it right on here. So you can get some really cool effects, and paint with watercolors on these. It gives you some ideas. Look at that texture. It's amazing. Look at that. Wow, so thick. But that's going to shrink as it dries a little bit. So that's 3 surfaces, Cradle Board. Can't get that off. Treated with 2 coats of gloss medium first, and then light dimensional ground. Okay, I'm going to put that over here to dry. And this is how, so far, how my absorbent ground is drying. Still pretty wet, but kind of fun. You can move it around. All right. Now, what's next? Let's go back to my headshot cam. Hi, everybody. How you doing with questions? Or Kathy answering everything? Looks like it. Okay, this is, yeah. All right, good. So next thing I'm going to do is show you how to use this through a stencil and how to mix some grounds. Let's see what we have here. 1:35. Oh, the time is good. All right. This is pretty fun. So you can also paint on canvas. And I just used this canvas that was, I put a layer of, get ready here. So what I did with this is I put down Watercolor Ground, okay? Watercolor Ground, this is the gray. back here. It's very matte looking. And so I spread that out. I tinted it with like a drop or two of Payne's Gray, fluid Payne's Gray. This is, I think, pretty highly tinting. Sort of transparent. But I put a few drops in that, mixed it up, diluted it, and put 2 coats of this watercolor ground on canvas. So this is just basic canvas, and but just a different surface. And again, you can also paint the sides of your canvas with, if I would have brought this absorbent ground around the side, it would have created a just a depth of a canvas that you could hang right on the wall without framing it. And then what I did, so you can see how the absorbent ground with the watercolor looks. I had a soft, just one layer. I can go back in with more layers of this. And then what I did for this stencil part is I laid a stencil on here, and I used cold press ground and a palette knife, and I spread the cold press ground just with a palette knife right through the stencil, just like that. And then pulled it. You may make sure it's straight. Make sure you don't move it when you're doing that, and then peel it off carefully. Put the stencil in water so the acrylic doesn't harden onto the stencil, and then let it dry overnight. And I did tint some of it up here with teal, and then it's just straight white right out of the jar down here. So I did 2 tinting and non-tinting with the ground. And then just for fun, I started playing around with watercolors. And this is, you know, pretty loose, and I'm just to show you that you can paint on different surfaces with watercolor. So this is on canvas. And now I want to show you how I did that with a stencil. So this is just a stencil, kind of timely with Day of the Dead coming up here on, I believe, on November 1st. And I taped the stencil down with tape, and this is on plexiglass. So right on plexiglass. I have this underneath. This is just on watercolor paper, just to show you how this will look when I pull it off. So I'm going to use cold press ground again on this, and it's cold press ground. And I like this because it's just thicker. I'm going to put a little bit in this paper plate. And then I'm going to put it right on here. And I have it taped down so that it doesn't move. But I'm just putting this on thinly. Kind of hard to do under a camera. But you get the idea at least. I'm just going to make sure it's about the same depth by scraping over it. So you can start seeing the outline of the stencil. All right, and then I'm going to pull the stencil off. Let's turn it again. There we go. And then I'm going to put the stencil into my bucket of water. So that acrylic doesn't dry on there. All right. You can tidy it up while it's still wet. But you can see how you could do some really cool things on different surfaces with these grounds. And then I can go back in, I can leave this white, or I can actually go back in and paint it with watercolor. All right, let's see. All right, let me talk a little bit about varnishing, and then we'll open it up to questions. So again, let me pull out these examples right here. This is cold pressed ground that's been varnished, and this is light dimensional ground that's been varnished. Okay. So when you varnish, a good thing to do is to, if say you're working on watercolor paper, for instance, you want to have a little extra painting on watercolor paper, just exactly what you're doing, to test the varnishing. So you may have a strip where you're working on watercolor and also working on your painting. And then when you go to varnish, you have that strip next to it, and you start by putting on 2 coats of gloss archival varnish by Golden. And this will, the 2 coats of gloss varnish will keep the color very bright. So 2 coats, let them dry in between, completely dry, touch dry. And then you want to do 2 coats of satin varnish. And satin varnish is going to bring that gloss back to more of a watercolor paper look. So 2 coats of satin, and then test your watercolor strip on the side after it's all dry, and see if you can lift any color with a brush, like with a wet brush. And if you can't, that means you don't need any more layers of varnish. If you can still lift that color a little bit, you might want to put another coat or 2 of satin on there. So depending on what you're doing, you could use up to 5 or 6 coats of spray varnish. But again, you do not want to use brush varnish because it will smear your painting. All right, I think I've covered everything I wanted to today. So let me shift back to my camera and see if you have any other questions for me. So let me take a look. All right, let's see here. All right, great. Let's see. All right. Any other questions? I don't see too many more coming in. I can't go way back up on here for some reason. So hopefully Kathy answered all your questions from previously. I hope that you got something out of this and that you'll try these grounds: watercolor ground, cold press ground, and light dimensional ground by QoR. I've had a lot of fun with these. They're you just can really try some new things, and it's just fun, you know. So let's see. I guess that's it. Again, I'm Nancy Seiler. I'm a working artist with Golden Artist Colors. I do a lot of nature journaling and teach nature journaling. And so sign up for my newsletter at nancyseiler.com. And I will, if you go to that site, www.nancyseiler.com, I am going to put photos of what I worked on today on my blog on that site. So you can take a look at those up close. They're pretty good photos. And you can take, blow them up and look at them really closely for texture and so forth before you go out and purchase these, for instance. Take a look at that. You can also sign up for my newsletter there, and I'm going to be offering some more online classes, mostly in nature journaling and how to draw plants. I'm a botanical illustrator, classical botanical illustrator, so I thought I'd do a class on how to draw plants in graphite. So that's going to be like a 6-session class. It's really in depth. But then the other ones will be shorter, much shorter, like an hour, hour and a half. So, gosh, thanks everybody for being here. This has been really fun, and I hope you have a great day. So, thank you. Bye-bye.